Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with the top 5 modern decks at the beginning of July 2022. As a friendly reminder, if you do like modern informative content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, and let us know what your top 5 deck lists in the format would be right now. Honorable mention, and I wouldn't even say this isn't even in consideration for top 5, but it is a deck that is near and dear to my heart, and a deck that also managed to win one of the 2 challenges this past weekend, which was Boros Burn. Deck that always pops up every now and again and feels like it's in a better position than it's been in some time. A deck that really struggled with the banning of Lurrus, even though it really had nothing to do with Lurrus. It was just the deck itself was kind of struggling, and seems to be putting up more positive results in some of the bigger events lately. So it's a deck you need to be prepared for, and it and Greentron both seem to be somewhat on the rise, as they do have some counter to some of the top decks in the format, although they are still weak to others. Burn's a very simple strategy in terms of its execution. Obviously plays cheap creatures, burn spells, try to lower your life total as quickly as possible, especially without the addition of Lurrus to the deck anymore. It really doesn't have much of a late game, other than those situations where your opponent's not pressuring your life total and you can kind of rebuild your hand with a couple of draw steps and maybe finish them off from 7-10 life, that kind of thing, with Boros Charms and such. But, deck I did want to mention, something you should be aware of, especially in your paper and various qualifiers and stuff, as getting ready for Pro Tour qualifiers and such, or whatever they're called these days. Burn is a deck you are going to see in paper quite a bit, as this is one of the decks people have as an entry point to Modern, and oftentimes it's one of the decks that doesn't get banned, so it's a deck that you're going to see probably maybe a little bit more overrepresented in paper meta than you would compared to Magic Online. Number 5 are the Yorum and Omnath piles, whichever variant we want to talk about, whether it's the Elementals version, whether it's the Counterspell version. There's really not a ton of difference in the lists, other than are you playing Counterspell or are you playing Risen Reef. But at the end, it's a lot of the same things. You're a core of Run-In 6 to Fairy Time Raveler and Omnath, playing the pitch elementals that go with that. You're playing some amount of Ice Fang Coatls, and then playing Ephemerate, Lightning Bolt, Prismatic Ending, March with the Rolly Light as an additional interaction besides your Furies and Solitudes. You're playing some number of Endurances, some number of Internal Witnesses. You're basically playing the ultimate value mid-range deck. This deck does border on control in terms of what it does, but it's a little bit more proactive, so it probably would be considered a mid-range deck in most things, and it's kind of become the king of the mid-range decks in the Modern format. There's a few decks that can go over top of it, decks like Tron, Living End can kind of ignore what it's doing, and Burn tends to have a fairly reasonable matchup and where they don't have a quick Omnath. But beyond that, this is a deck that can go head-to-head with the top deck of the format that we'll get to in a bit. But, this deck and all its variants have, bounced around the top 5 lists the past couple months. Sometimes it's been arguably the number 1 deck in the format right now. It's a little bit less on the results end. Some of that might have to do with the All Access Pass, was a little bit down, and then people may have access to other decks in paper a little bit more readily than this one, because this is probably the most expensive deck in the Modern format, but still deck you need to be prepared for. It's a deck full of value, and you need to get under it to kill it, or be able to go way over the top of it with something like Greentron and possibly Amulet Titan. Number 4 is a deck that, much like Burn and Greentron, is a little bit on the rise. That is Grixis Death Shadow. This was previously the best deck in the format on a couple of different occasions, both before the banning of Lurrus of the Dream Den, and then previously when it was the older versions with Gurmag Angler and Death Shadow. When it first kind of burst on the scene, it was one of the top decks in the format then. It's a deck that really rewards efficient, tight gameplay by playing cheap interactive spells, as well as cheap, powerful creatures, and it's recently added Ledger Shredder to the list of things that it does powerfully. Beyond that, you have the combinations of Inquisitions and Thoughtseizes to pressure your opponent's hand. You have things like Drown and Unlock and counter spells out of your sideboard, kind of interact with your opponent on the stack. You also have things like Unholy Heat and Terminate, as well as Lightning Bolt and Fatal Push to deal with your opponent's creatures. This deck is basically the all-in-one package, and if it weren't for the number 1 deck, would probably be pushing for one of the top tier decks in the format, but as of right now, it's number 4 on the list because there's one deck that does what it does a little bit better, but it is a deck that's on the rise and does get to play Gigantha as a companion, as a little bit of a bonus. The deck that I think I seem to always put at number 3, that is Hammer Time. This is basically the infect / aggressive deck of the format of choice. Players Colossus Hammer with some way to equip it by cheating the equip cost with things like Sigarda's Aid and Pure Steel Paladin. You have almost infinite ways to find this in your deck, whether it's Urza's Sagas, Steel Shaper's Gifts, Stoneforge Mystics, or just copies of Hammer itself. You're often able to find Hammer and turn almost everything into a threat. It's a deck that requires a bunch of removal to keep it in check, and you can almost never take your guard down. Although sometimes you do have to, go for it a little bit against this deck, and if they don't have it, they don't have it. But, this is the deck that just has the oops, I win factor the most of the top decks in the modern format. And it's a deck that kind of keeps, decks that would otherwise maybe skimp on their creature removal a little bit, keeps them a little bit more honest as to what they're doing. But, this is kind of the infect aggressive deck hybrid of the format now, and something you need to be aware of, as it does have still a decent grindy plan with Pure Steel Paladin drawing you cards, the Reality Chip, Stoneforge Mystic now being a genuine threat, both are playing Caldera Complete, and, various ways to protect its creatures, whether it be the blue version that has Spell Pierces and the different ways to protect it as well. Things like Giver of Runes, Steel Shaper's Gift, Spell Pierce, Steel Shaper's Gift, I believe, is the one. Not Steel Shaper's Gift. There's a Blacksmith's Skill is a way to protect the creatures as well. So, it has this odd balance of giving its creatures hexproof, protecting them from opponent's spells, while also, getting a little bit of card advantage with things like Pure Steel Paladin and Reality Chip. So it's a deck that's not just dead to hard removal, and then obviously has the one-shot kill with Inkmoth Nexus and Colossus Hammer, regardless of what your opponent's life total. Definitely a deck you need to respect and be prepared for, especially people that tend to pilot it tend to know the deck very well. And, it does come in 3 flavors: mono white, blue white, or black white. Number 2 is the Cascade decks, primarily Rhinos and Living End. While they execute slightly different strategies of what they're doing, oftentimes they just play one of their Cascaders on turn 3, play their powerful spell, and then kind of back it up with other forms of disruption to get for the win. In Crashing Footfall's case, that happens to be 2/4 for Rhinos, so sometimes you can get 10 power on turn 3. Turn 2, if you happen to have Gemstone Caverns on the draw, which puts your opponent under a lot of pressure, and then you use things like Force of Negation, Fire Ice, Dead Gone, Brazen Borrower, and Fury to kind of clear the way to kill them in the meantime. You get to play a bunch of utility cards like Blood Moon and Leyline in your sideboards. So while you don't have a ton of room to tinker with your deck terribly much, with only being able to play 3 MC costs and less, although obviously you have ways around that with Fire Ice, Dead Gone, and the adventure creatures, still this allows you to play kind of a powerful tempo game, although not the best tempo deck in the format. And then the other variant, you have Living End here, which is basically a 1-card combo with the card Living End and your Cascade spells. You cycle a bunch of these various cycling creatures, get them into your graveyard, disrupt what your opponent's doing. One deck is a little bit more vulnerable to a conventional game plan. Living End is a little bit more vulnerable to Grave Hate. So they both have a little bit of weaknesses in what they're doing, although they both require specific cards to kind of deal with what they're doing. Some decks can just hard counter them. 4-color Omnath can do a pretty decent job against Rhinos, while Living End struggles with Graveyard Hate, etc., and gives 4-color Omnath a bit of fits. But both decks have their nut draws that can just get you in certain situations, as I was reminded of this past weekend stream, where I got turn 2 Rhino and turn 3 Rhino with my opponent on the draw with a Gemstone Cavern. So these are both very powerful decks, things you need to respect in the format, and something to keep an eye on. But once again, number 1 should be no shocker to anyone who's been playing Modern lately. Number 1 is it Murktide, whatever variant you see, as the versions that have been popping up a little bit more and more have been cutting Dragon Rage's Channeler for 4 copies of Ledger Shredder. Well, this is not necessarily a downgrade or upgrade. DRC is a little bit more vulnerable to Graveyard Hate, obviously, and while they do very similar things as far as filling up the graveyard, DRC, does have the disadvantage of being targeted by Graveyard Hate a little bit, and can get randomly pinged off by things like Run in 6 before you can get Delirium. Whereas Ledger Shredder, you really usually have to invest a card in killing it, and sometimes it can grow out of range of bolts and such. Sometimes even Unholy Heat in the mid to late game, and kind of serves as another big body besides Murktide Regent in the mid to late game, especially as you're a deck that prides itself on playing multiple spells in a turn, and it also benefits from your opponent playing multiple spells. This is a deck that basically sees almost every card in its deck whenever it wants to, so it can get away with playing like 2 pieces of, two Flusterstorms, and it's basically the same as 4. And then it gets to play among the most efficient disruption in the format, whether it be things like Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt, Counterspell, Archmage's Charm, Expressive Iteration, a card that's now banned in the Pioneer format, gets to play Mishra's Bauble. Basically, it is Grixis Death Shadow with an even more powerful top end and even more powerful spells at its disposal. Part of the reason why Temur Rhinos and Grixis Death Shadow have not been as great as they could possibly be is they're simply not the best at what they do anymore. Murktide is a better tempo deck than Temur Rhinos, and it's also a better efficiency deck even than the Grixis Death Shadow decks are now, especially without Lurrus being able to outgrind these decks. That said, there are the two variants. You do have the Dragon Rage's Chandler variant, you do have the Legislator heavier variants. Both of them, kind of exist in tandem, although sites like MTG Goldfish have started to separate them and called this, is it control? It's not a control deck. It's Murktide with different threats, basically. But, just shows the embarrassment of riches that this deck has, that it can play these powerful threats and not miss a beat whichever ones it chooses to play, whether it wants to play around Graveyard, play around a removal a little bit more. Also diversifies your threats against things like engineered explosives. But this is a deck that's probably been the king of the format for quite some time, and the only deck that could probably make an argument if it saw as much play would be the 4-color Omnath piles. But that requires a little bit more money, a little bit more patience, and those things add up to Murktide seeing a little bit more play. Plus, you do get the earlier efficient turns earlier in the game. You're not as weak to things like Living End and such, whereas 4-color Control or 4-color Omnath is a little bit weak to things like Living End. So your spread of matchups is different, and oftentimes they actually kind of cover each other's weaknesses a little bit. Like Murktide has gotten very efficient and very good at burn matchups, whereas 4-color Omnath can struggle a little bit and it's slower mopier draws, especially game 1. So, Murktide's an okay matchup against Living End, whereas 4-color Omnath, not so great. They both have tools to fight all the matchups, so, there isn't a ton of difference between number 1 and number 5 really anymore, but, Murktide is just probably slightly above all the rest of the decks just because of its efficiency, gets to play all the powerful interaction in blue and red, and, pretty much anymore has very, very few weaknesses, especially since it's not as weak to Graveyard Hate anymore. So, this is a deck to keep an eye on. Its sister deck in Legacy has seen multiple bannings, with Ragavan getting a banning in Legacy, and that being Blue-Red Delver. So, there are parallels between the two decks, although, this deck doesn't have the Dazes, Force of Wills, and such. It does, still have a lot of early interaction, very cheap tempo, and has threats that can win the game on their own, whether it's Legislator, Ragavan, or Murktide. Each card unanswered can win you the game. So, that's it. This has been our top 5 for this month. A little bit later than I wanted to do, but, better late than never. So, this has been John for MTG Nexus with our top 5 decks in the Modern format this month.